Hello, brave hearts, and welcome back to Girls Who Rise, a storytelling podcast made just for you. Let me ask you something. Have you ever looked back at an old picture of yourself and thought, wow, I've changed? Maybe you were shorter. Maybe you liked different things. Maybe you thought about the world a little differently than you do now. Most of the time, growing doesn't happen all at once. It happens so slowly we hardly notice it while it's happening. Then, one day, we look back and realize we've learned something new, become a little braver, or understand ourselves a little better than we used to. Today's episode is about that kind of growing. Not the kind you can measure with a ruler, the kind that happens inside, the kind that happens one day at a time, one lesson at a time, and sometimes one mistake at a time. We're stepping back into Anne's world again, a world where friendships grow deeper, a world where the future starts to feel a little closer. In a world where Anne is beginning to discover that growing up doesn't mean leaving everything behind. Sometimes it means carrying the things you love with you as you move forward. But before we begin, here's a quick story note. This story was written a long time ago, so I've abridged it. That means I've shortened some parts to make it easier to listen to. But I've kept the heart of the story just the way the author intended. It's still Anne's story, told in a simpler way. Now, sit back, get cozy, and, if you'd like, place your hand gently over your heart. Take a slow breath in and breathe out. Again, slow breath in and out. Remember, the way you notice the world is special. Your thoughts matter. Your feelings deserve to be listened to. And you are growing, even if you can't see it yet. This is a place for big feelings, brave hearts, and stories that help us grow. This is a place for you. Now, let's return to Green Gables. Anne of Green Gables by L.M. Montgomery. Chapter 30. A Big Change for Anne. The months following Anne's unfortunate experiment with hair dye passed far more peacefully than anyone, especially Anne, might have expected. By midsummer, her hair had returned to its familiar shade of red, the green dye had become little more than an embarrassing memory, and Avonlea had moved on to other things. Anne had moved on too. One warm afternoon, Anne and Diana found a shady place beneath the orchard trees at Green Gables. The grass was soft from a recent rain, and a breeze stirred the leaves overhead while two friends rested side by side, talking in the easy way that only very dear friends can. Anne smiled and stretched out beneath the orchard tree. "Do you ever think about all the trouble I've managed to find since coming to Avonlea?" she asked. Diana laughed. "Which trouble? There has been so much of it." "That's exactly my point," Anne said. "At the time, each disaster seemed enormous. Falling off the roof, the raspberry cordial, my dreadful green hair. You were always certain life would never recover." Anne laughed. "I really did. But somehow you always managed," Diana said. Anne was quiet for a moment. "And now, there's some of my favorite stories." Diana turned toward her. "Really?" Anne nodded. "Not because they were pleasant at the time. They certainly weren't. But when I think about them now, I remember how much has happened since I first came to Green Gables." Diana picked a blade of grass. "I like remembering them." "So do I," Anne said. "But sometimes looking back at happy memories makes me notice how fast I'm growing up." Diana was quiet for a moment. "Do you think growing up means we won't have as much fun?" Anne looked out toward the fields where the sunlight lay golden and still. "Oh, I don't think so. At least I hope not. I think it means we're noticing different things. When I was younger, I thought growing up meant having all the answers. Now I think it might just mean learning that a bad day isn't the end of the story." That evening, after Diana had gone home, Anne sat on the front porch steps while Matthew worked nearby. For a long while, neither of them spoke. The sounds of Green Gables settled in around them, Marilla moving about in the kitchen, the soft clink of a pail, the distant call of birds in the orchard. At last Anne said, "Matthew, did you ever feel yourself changing before you were ready?" Matthew looked up from what he was doing. "I can't say I remember it quite that way." I do," Anne said. "Only I don't know exactly what is changing. I still feel like myself, yet I don't feel like the same Anne who came here." Matthew's face softened. "You were always Anne." "Yeah," she said slowly, "but I think I'm becoming more Anne than I was back then. Does that make sense?" Matthew gave one of his small smiles. "I think it does." "When I first came to Green Gables, I wanted everything to be beautiful and exciting all the time. If something wasn't beautiful, I tried to imagine that it was. But now," she paused, searching for the right words, "now I think ordinary things are beautiful too." Matthew nodded. "That sounds like growing up." "It feels a little sad," Anne confessed. "Most growing does, I reckon." Anne looked at him. "But it feels good too." Matthew smiled. "Then I expect you're doing it right." During the weeks that followed, she noticed the change more often. She noticed it when she helped Marilla without being asked. She noticed it when she studied longer than she once would have, not because anyone forced her, but because she wanted to be ready for whatever came next. When she was younger, Green Gables had seemed like a dream come true, a place so wonderful she was almost afraid it might disappear. Now it was home. It was the place that had held her through mistakes and joys and tears and triumphs. It taught her that being loved did not mean being perfect. One evening near the end of summer, Anne and Diana walked along the quiet road between their homes. "Promise me something," Diana said suddenly. "Okay, what?" "Promise that even when things change, we'll still be friends." Anne stopped walking and looked at her as if the answer was the most certain thing in the world. "Diana Barry, I could no more stop being your friend than I could stop being Anne Shirley." "I know. I just wanted to hear you say it." Anne slipped her arm through Diana's. "Things may change, but real friendship doesn't have to disappear just because we grow older." They walked on together, arm in arm, while the evening deepened around them. That night, Anne stood at her bedroom window and looked out over the orchard. The trees were dark shapes beneath the stars, and the house was quiet. She thought of the girl she had been when she had first come to Green Gables, thin and eager and afraid of being sent away. She thought of all the versions of herself she had been since then: the lonely girl, the dramatic girl, the angry girl, the sorry girl, and the brave girl. And now here she was, not finished, not grown up entirely, but changing. Anne rested her forehead against the window frame and smiled softly. Childhood was not vanishing all at once. It was simply becoming a part of her, something she would carry forward into the next chapter of her life. And though Anne did not know exactly what waited ahead, she no longer felt she had to. For the first time, the future did not seem like something to fear or rush toward. It felt like a road stretching ahead through the darkness, one she would travel one step at a time. And for now, that was enough. Chapter 31. Queen's Class is Organized. The quiet, thoughtful days of late summer did not last forever. They never do. Before Anne was quite ready for it, the golden afternoons began to shorten, the mornings grew cooler, and Avonlea stirred itself back into the familiar rhythm of school. Books were gathered, lunches were packed, and the children who had spent the summer roaming fields and orchards returned once more to their desks. Anne returned too, but not quite the same girl who had left in the spring. She still loved to walk to school, with the trees arching overhead and the road winding past places that held 100 memories. She still loved seeing Diana waiting for her, still loved the sound of students calling to one another across the schoolyard. But beneath all that familiar happiness, Anne felt something new. The future. The future no longer seemed like a faraway thing that belonged to some day. It was beginning to feel close. Miss Stacy seemed to feel it too. There were extra books on her desk, extra papers in her hands, and more than once Anne caught her looking thoughtfully at all the students as though she were measuring not just what they knew, but what they might become. One afternoon, Miss Stacy stood before the class. "I have something important to tell you," she said. As some of you know, Miss Stacy continued, students who wish to continue their education may prepare for the entrance examinations to Queen's Academy. Everyone knew Queen's Academy. It was the place where students studied if they had hoped to become teachers. This year, I am organizing a special class for those who wish to prepare for the tests. It won't be easy, but for those who are willing to try, I believe it will be worth it. Anne felt her heart give a quick, eager leap. Queen's Academy. She could almost see it, herself walking into a larger classroom, carrying books that mattered, learning things that would help her make something of her life, not just imagining a future, but working toward one. Miss Stacy began reading the name of the students she believed were ready for the challenge. She read Anne's name, Anne Shirley, and then Gilbert Blythe. Of course, Gilbert would be in the class. Of course. A familiar spark stirred inside her, that determination that had pushed her forward so many times before. But it felt different now. When Anne was younger, competing with Gilbert often made her angry. Now, mostly, it made her want to work harder. She no longer wanted to defeat Gilbert simply because he was Gilbert. She wanted to do her best because something inside her had begun to believe that she could. Still, if Gilbert Blythe happened to score higher in a test than she did, Anne saw no reason to be pleased about it. When school ended that day, the yard buzzed with excitement. Diana walked close beside Anne on the road home. Don't worry, you'll do great, Diana said. I don't know about that, Anne replied, but I mean to work harder than I've ever worked in my life. That sounds exhausting. Anne smiled and then grew quiet. What is it? Diana asked. I was just thinking, Anne said. This feels different from the things I used to dream about. When I was younger, I imagined all sorts of grand futures. But this is different. This is not just imagining, this is choosing something and then having to work for it. Diana looked at her thoughtfully. Does that scare you? A little, I guess, Anne said. And then she smiled. But it also makes me feel very alive. By the time Anne reached Green Gables, she could hardly keep the news inside her. She found Marilla in the kitchen, measuring out flour with her usual carefulness. Marilla, Anne burst out, Miss Stacy is organizing a Queen's class, and she has suggested me to be part of it. Marilla did not drop the flour or cry out in excitement. Marilla Cuthbert rarely did such things. Well, Marilla said, I expected as much. Anne blinked. You did? But you'll need to stick with it, Marilla continued. There will be days when studying feels exciting, and days when it doesn't. You can't give up when it gets difficult. I know, Anne said. I do know that, and I mean to keep going even when it isn't easy. Marilla gave a small nod. It was not a speech full of praise, but what Anne heard was that Marilla believed she could do it. And somehow, Marilla's practical confidence felt stronger than any compliment. That evening, when Matthew came in from the barn, Anne told the whole story again. Matthew listened as though there were nothing in the world he would rather hear. So I will have to study very hard, Anne finished, harder than ever. And there will be tests, Matthew, real ones, important ones. I suppose there will, Matthew said. And I may fail. You may. Anne looked startled. Matthew! Well, he said gently, you may, but I don't expect you will. You always think I can do things. Mostly because you usually can. That simple sentence carried Anne through many long evenings afterward. The Queen's class began almost at once. Anne and the other students studied with Miss Stacy. The room felt different then, quieter, more serious, with the low scratch of pencils, the turning of pages, and Miss Stacy's calm voice guiding them through difficult lessons. There was so many things to learn: history, mathematics, literature. Anne discovered that wanting a thing did not make the work easy. Some days her head ached with facts. Some evenings she came home so tired that even her imagination seemed to sit down in a chair and rest, but she kept going. She studied at the kitchen table. She carried books outdoors and read beneath the trees. She repeated dates while walking down the lane and worked problems until numbers finally untangled themselves. And when she grew discouraged, she remembered Miss Stacy's steady voice. Gilbert worked hard, too. Anne could not help noticing. He was quick with math, careful with his answers, and maddeningly calm when difficult questions came his way. More than once, Anne found herself measuring her progress against his, just as she had done for years. But the old rivalry had changed. Gilbert was someone she wanted to match, perhaps surpass, but he was also someone who made her work harder. One afternoon, Miss Stacy returned a set of papers. Anne received hers excitedly and looked at the mark. A. A proud warmth spread through her. Then, from across the room, she heard Charlie Sloane whisper, "Gilbert got 1 point higher." Anne's eyes flew to Gilbert's paper before she could stop herself. 1 point. Only one. Gilbert glanced over and caught her looking. For a moment, Anne expected him to smirk, the way he might have years before. Instead, he gave a small smile. Anne quickly looked back at her own paper. 1 point was not the end of the world. Still, she intended to get that point back. As autumn deepened, the Queen's class became a part of Anne's life in a way she had never expected. Each lesson seemed to lead somewhere. Each difficult page felt like one step toward a future that was beginning to take shape. And yet, with every step forward, Anne felt how much she loved the life around her. She loved coming home to Green Gables after a long day of study. She loved the lamp glowing in the kitchen window. She loved Matthew asking, in his quiet way, how the lesson had gone. She loved Marilla reminding her not to study herself sick. One night, after a long session with her books, Anne closed them at last and leaned back in her chair. "Marilla." "Yes." "Do you think I could become a teacher one day?" Marilla's hands paused over her sewing. "If you keep working as you are, I don't see why not." It was such a plain answer. No grand promise, no dramatic encouragement, just Marilla's honest belief. Later, as she climbed up the stairs to bed, Anne felt tired all the way through. She didn't know exactly what the future would look like, but she knew one thing. Tomorrow morning she would get up and try. The future no longer felt like a faraway dream. Chapter 32, Where the Brook and the River Meet. Several weeks passed after the Queen's class began. Anne quickly discovered that preparing for tests required far more time than she expected. Some evenings seemed to disappear entirely between schoolwork and chores at Green Gables. To Anne's surprise, she didn't mind most of the time. She enjoyed the feeling of working towards something important. She liked the challenge of difficult lessons and the satisfaction that came from finally understanding a problem that had seemed impossible only an hour before. Even so, there were moments when she missed the long, carefree afternoons she and Diana had once spent wandering across Avonlea with no particular destination in mind. One bright afternoon, Anne closed her books with a sigh. "I believe my brain has reached its limit," she announced. Marilla glanced up. "Then perhaps your brain should go outside for a while." "I think that's an excellent idea." A few minutes later, she was hurrying down the road toward Diana's house. Diana was delighted to see her. "Have you escaped from Queen's class?" "For one afternoon," Anne replied. "Good," Diana said. "I was beginning to think Miss Stacy had decided to keep you forever." "I'm afraid she has tried." The two girls laughed and set off down one of their favorite paths. For a while, they simply enjoyed being together. There was something comforting about walking beside a friend who knew nearly all of your stories. After a time, Diana glanced sideways at Anne. "Do you ever feel as though everything is moving faster than it used to?" Anne laughed softly. "Only every day." "Oh, I thought it was only me." "Nope," Anne said. "I feel it too." Diana kicked a leaf from the path. "It seems as though we were only just starting school yesterday. And now everyone keeps talking about tests and the future." Anne nodded. "I suppose that's what growing up feels like," Anne said. Diana made a funny face. They continued walking until they reached one of Anne's favorite places in all of Avonlea. A small brook wound its way through the trees before joining a wider river farther downstream. Anne had loved the spot for years. For several minutes they simply listened to the sound of the water. "It always feels different here," Diana said quietly. "What does?" "Everything." Anne understood exactly what she meant. The worries that seemed so large at school now somehow felt smaller beside the brook. Even time itself seemed to slow down. "I've always loved this place," Anne said. "So have I," Diana replied. The brook danced past them, sparkling in the sunlight. Diana watched it for a moment before pointing toward the place where it joined the river. "Do you think the brook disappears when it reaches the river?" Anne followed her gaze. "No," she said after a moment. "I don't think it disappears. What do you think happens to it then?" Anne watched the water flowing together. "I think it becomes part of something larger." Diana considered that for a moment. "But it's still the same water," Anne replied. The two girls sat together quietly. Neither spoke for a while after that. At last, Diana smiled. "Do you remember when we thought we would spend every afternoon together forever?" Anne laughed. "I remember believing in a great many impossible things." The truth was, life had changed, not all at once, but little by little. There were more responsibilities now. Yet as Anne sat beside Diana, she realized something important. Growing up had changed many things, but it had not changed this. She still trusted Diana with every secret. She still laughed harder when Diana was around. She still felt happier after spending an afternoon with her best friend. Some things, it seemed, could grow without disappearing. The afternoon passed quickly after that. The girls talked about books, school, friends, and all the small happenings that filled their days. Some of their conversations were serious, others were wonderfully silly. Eventually, they stood and started home. When they reached the crossroads where they would part ways, Diana hesitated. "I'm glad you came today." "So am I," Anne replied. "Let's do it again soon." "We will." Anne watched Diana disappear down the road before turning to Green Gables. Later that evening, after supper and a little studying, Anne climbed the stairs to her room. Before getting into bed, she paused at the window, her favorite spot. She found herself thinking once more about the brook and the river. For a long time, Anne had worried that growing up meant leaving things behind, leaving friendships, leaving parts of herself she loved most. But maybe it wasn't like that at all. Maybe growing up was more like a brook meeting the river. The brook didn't disappear, it simply became part of something larger while still remaining itself. Life was changing, she could feel that. But change did not have to mean losing the things she loved. Sometimes it simply meant carrying them with you as you move forward. As Anne climbed into bed, she found herself looking forward to whatever came next. This is where we stop today, Bravehearts. Let's take a minute and look back at what we just experienced. And as we talk about it, just notice how you're feeling right now. Not just what you're thinking, but what you feel inside, too. In these chapters, we see Anne standing at an interesting part of her life. For a long time, Anne spent much of her energy hoping for things. She hoped to belong. She hoped to be accepted. She hoped life would become the beautiful story she had imagined that it could be. But now, something is beginning to change. Anne is no longer imagining her future. She's beginning to take steps toward it. When Miss Stacy creates a Queen's class, Anne realizes that some dreams require more than wishing. They require effort, patience, and the willing to keep going, even when something feels difficult. We also see Anne looking back on many of the moments that once felt enormous. The raspberry cordial, falling off the roof, her disastrous green hair. At the time, each one felt like the end of the world. But now she can smile when she remembers them, not because they were fun, but because they remind her of how much she has learned and how much she has grown. And I think that's something that many of us experience too. Sometimes the things that once embarrassed us or made us want to hide eventually become stories that we enjoy telling, not because we liked them at the time, but because they remind us of how far we've come and who's helped us through them. We also spend time with Anna and Diana beside the brook and the river. As they sit together, they begin to notice something that happens to many people as they grow older. Life gets busier. Days seem to move faster. Sometimes that can feel a little sad, even when nothing is wrong. But Anne realizes something important beside the water. The brook doesn't disappear when it joins the river. It becomes a part of something larger. And people grow that way too. We don't lose every part of who we were. We carry our memories, our friendships, and our experiences with us. They become part of the person we're becoming. Anne is changing, but she isn't becoming someone else. She's simply learning new things about herself as she grows. So let's name the big feelings we saw today, because when feelings have names, they become easier to understand. Growth. Growth is what happens when we learn from our experiences. Sometimes we don't notice it while it's happening. We only notice it later when we look back and realize we aren't reacting the same way we once did. Anne sees that when she remembers the mistakes that once felt impossible to survive. At the time, each one felt enormous, but now she can smile when she remembers them because she knows those moments didn't last forever. Have you ever had something happen that felt really embarrassing at the time? Maybe you answered a question wrong. Maybe you made a mistake and you wished you could disappear. Then, later, it didn't feel nearly as important as it once did. That's often how growth works. Determination. Determination is the feeling that helps us continue even when something feels difficult. It's the part of us that says, I'll keep trying. Anne feels that when she joins the Queen's class. She knows that there will be hard lessons ahead, but she decides to keep going anyway. Have you ever worked hard to learn something new? Maybe riding a bike, practicing an instrument, or trying a new sport? Most people don't get those things right the first time. Determination is what helps us keep practicing, even when we feel frustrated or tired. Change. Change is the feeling that appears when life begins opening new doors. Sometimes change feels exciting. Sometimes it feels uncomfortable. And very often it feels like both at the same time. Anne and Diana notice that life isn't quite the same as it used to be. They don't spend every afternoon together anymore. They have more responsibilities and more things to think about. Have you ever changed schools, moved to a new section in class, joined a new activity, or made new friends? At first, those changes can feel strange, but often those same changes can help us discover new things about ourselves. As Anne is beginning to discover, change doesn't always mean losing something. And that's one of the most surprising parts of growing up. As life changes around us, we begin to change too. We learn new things. We understand ourselves a little better. Anne is beginning to notice that in herself. The same girl who once thought every mistake was the end of the world can now look back at some of those moments with a smile. And before we finish today, I want to leave you with one more thought. The things that once hurt us can become part of the stories we treasure, not because we're glad that they happened, and not because we would choose to go through them again, but because when we look back, we sometimes realize those moments helped shape us in ways we couldn't see at the time. We recognize it when we look back and realize that we are not standing in quite the same place we were once before. I had such a good time reading with you today. Before we go, let's take one slow breath in and a gentle breath out. I would like you to always remember you belong here. You matter. Until we meet again, be gentle with your heart. Keep noticing your thoughts and feelings. And remember, learning, growing, changing, and even feeling a little uncertain sometimes is a part of being brave. Until next time, brave hearts, see you soon.